think of ethics as a code of rules which people agree not to break. But what if ethics could be more like playing music, requiring teaching and practice, but enabling you eventually to perform with pleasure, skill, and grace? Until recent decades, modern ethics was dominated by two approaches that focus on action. Utilitarians ask, how can we act to produce the best possible results? Followers of the ideas of Immanuel Kant, or Kantians, ask, how can we act to give full respect to others? But both of these approaches seem to leave something out. What about the person who takes action? What about your values and character? Aren't these relevant to ethics? The movement to center ethics on character rather than actions has come to be known as virtue ethics.
Well, one advantage that virtue ethics has is that I think it does start from a very natural way in which we think about our lives. What I call the entry point for ethical reflection, thinking about your life as a whole. And the advantage of that is, I think, people do think about their lives as a whole and whether their lives are going well or badly. And there are numerous topics that fall naturally into thinking about that. Thinking about the emotions, thinking about your commitments to other people, thinking about your friends, thinking about your social responsibilities.
Looking at ethics in terms of who you are and how your life is going is not new.
Socrates loved to cite one of the inscriptions over at the shrine at Delphi, know thyself. In a certain sense, all the Greeks, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, moving backwards, found this to be true, that the value in human life was ultimately to be gained by knowing our own natures and knowing what it would take to perfect those natures, to take our natural possibilities and to actualize them.
At the core of ancient Greek ethics was the quest for eudaimonia, which is often translated happiness, but in a distinctive sense.
I prefer the term human flourishing, which reminds us that we're talking about a complex form of human activity, which has a number of different parts that are not reducible to the others, and that doesn't just consist in a feeling of satisfaction. So it means a total form of activity that includes all the major human functions, that is, in that sense, a complete life for a human being.
The Greek word arete may be translated as either virtue or excellence.
They did not distinguish between morality, quotes morality, and other aspects of personal life. It was a much more integrated picture. They thought much more in terms of what made for a worthwhile life for the individual, in which these various aspects could be brought together.
So with virtue ethics, we can talk about the role of entertaining friends, giving dinner parties, all these things that Aristotle actually discusses in the Ethics, and then, put that alongside the more obvious and commonly recognized virtues like courage and justice. And I think that helps a lot. I mean, we have to see the life as a whole before we can see what the part of each virtue is in it.
Often in ancient philosophy, virtues are compared to skills. In the words of Aristotle,
As is the case with any skill, we acquire the virtues by first doing virtuous acts. We acquire a skill by practicing the activities involved in the skill. For example, we become builders by building, and we learn to play the harp by playing the harp. In the same way, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and courageous by doing acts of courage.
He thinks you acquire a virtue typically by being shown other people who have that virtue, and you do what they do. And gradually you see the point of doing what they do, and you learn how to do it the way they do it. And there's obvious analogies with skills, like learning to play an instrument.
any definition of virtues implies a standard for how people ought to be. For Plato and Aristotle, reason ought to guide emotion and appetite. Each of these basic parts of human nature has its own special virtue.
The special virtue of the rational part of the soul is wisdom. The special virtue of the spirited part of the soul is courage. And the special virtue of the appetitive part of the soul is self-control or temperance, control over one's own appetites. All of these virtues come into being, so to speak, at the same time or under the same condition, and that is where justice is obtained, where there's a balance of the soul.
As a guideline for living in accord with reason, Aristotle recommends seeking the mean or middle course between extremes.
Acting well in any field is achieved by looking to the mean and bringing one's actions into line with this standard of moderation. Virtue, therefore, must also aim at the mean. For human virtue deals with our feelings and actions. And in these, we can go to excess or fall short, or we can hit the mean.
We tend to think of values as toggle switches. There's right and wrong. There's on and off. There's good and its opposite. For Aristotle, virtue was finding the middle ground between two opposites.
Generosity is not opposed to meanness. Generosity actually is in the middle of, on the one hand, stinginess and meanness, and on the other hand, being profligate with money.
Aristotle analyzes courage as the mean between the excess of what we might call bravado, the person who runs into a hail of bullets. I mean, that's not brave, that's just foolish. And cowardice on the other hand.
To seek the mean might seem a simple guideline, but it requires balancing many factors.
It is possible to feel fear, confidence, desire, anger, pity, pleasure, and so on, either too much or too little, both of which extremes are bad. But to feel these at the right times and on the right occasions, and toward the right persons, and with the right object, and in the right fashion, is the mean between the extremes, and is the best state, and is the mark of virtue.
The right answer is the answer which is appropriate proston kairon, which perhaps is best translated into English as the occasion demands. And the occasion is itself something that's continually changing.
It's a bit like the pianist who plays the notes in the right way, at the right time, at the right speed, with the right, all the details of piano performance. It takes a long time to train yourself to get like that, and a lot of experience.
The The contrast between virtue ethics and other approaches stands out clearly in how to make sound judgments in complex situations.
I think that utilitarianism and Kantianism, what they're trying to do, I personally think they can't do it, but what they're trying to do is to produce a kind of decision procedure at the limit. That's a bit simplified, but roughly a way of working out what to do. Now, virtue ethics shouldn't even pretend to be telling you how to work out what to do.
Now, the story that virtue ethics has to tell about right action doesn't give you a formula. It doesn't tell you how to find out what the right action is if you otherwise would have no clue about it. So it's not something such that you could read a few pages and then suddenly be able to know what the right action is.
The whole point of virtue ethics is to say the ethical condition is not the condition of having a certain right theory. What virtue ethics tells us is that the desirable ethical condition is having a certain character.
What traits of character, then, can help you judge the best course in a complex situation? Aristotle proposes a virtue which he calls phronesis, practical intelligence or wisdom.
The best way to see what practical wisdom is to start with skills again, I think. That first of all you learn what it is that you have to do. To play the piano, you've got to move your fingers in certain ways. And to do that, you have to learn scales and various things like that. You learn the right things to do. And then gradually you learn why those are the things you have to do. You learn not just that you play this scale and that scale and the other scale. You learn how all the various bits of technique that you learn fit together as the technique of the pianist. So there's two things. That first of all, your understanding of what you're doing becomes more global. You understand what you're doing now and then what you're doing next and so on. And gradually you come to see the point of doing what you're doing as a whole. And the other way in which practical wisdom develops is you get a deeper and deeper understanding of the point of acting as you're acting. So you don't just act in a certain way because your dad told you or because you were told to do that at school. You come to see why you should do that.
One of the interesting differences between Aristotle, say, and his whole approach to ethics, and someone like Kant, is that for Aristotle, the ultimate ethical good, the best place to be, is a place where you act in a way that is that feels right to you, that feels good to you, that actually gives you pleasure in doing the right thing. The payoff, as it were, in all these ethics, Greek ethics, such as Aristotle's, they say is in happiness. We will live a happy life if we live a virtuous life.
Virtue ethics has become popular again partly because it parallels many features of modern psychology. One of these is a high regard for emotion. Other ethical theories tend to treat emotion as a distraction. Virtue ethics sees reason and emotion as closely allied.
That standard picture of here's the force of reason and goodness embattled with the forces of desire and temptation, that's a terrible way to think about ourselves. And what the virtue ethics picture gives us is a different way.
So we can talk about the role of the emotions, the role of pleasure, the role of all these complicated psychological items in the good life. And we also have room to say that a life isn't complete if the emotions are not fully cultivated and don't have an appropriate place in it.
Virtue ethics also recognizes how we become who we are through relationships with others. The affection that parents show an infant sets in motion a lifelong process.
Your parents kiss you tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow. That makes no difference in the world. But over 20 years, those kisses provide a tidal wave of affirmation for which there can be no substitute. And it's not even clear to me that years of therapy afterwards could make the difference if one hadn't had those kisses to begin with, those genuine moments of affection. And my thought is, once those genuine moments of affection are in place, then morality can take a much stronger hold upon us. And that living morally is, in that sense, foundational upon, or is set upon, the extent to which the parent-child affections are called forth. And the more mightily they're called forth, I think the easier it is to live morally, because part of what living morally is about is being able to be responsive to others, to hear the other, to hear the voice, to hear the eyes, to hear the nonverbal behavior.
A form of virtue ethics called care ethics sees personal relationships as the primary arena for ethical behavior.
It's a very concrete standpoint, focused on the specifics of how someone interacts with those that she loves. And it brings her attention to matters of not hurting others, attending to their needs, being emotionally aware of them, being sensitive to what they want and how things are with them. And it also focuses someone's attention on the importance of the relationship itself.
When I study classical music, I think the one sentence that stayed with me is the following: the most beautiful voice will never equal 100 voices singing softly. You just can't have the richness. You just can't have it. And the most perfect moral life, all by itself, never yields the richness of social interaction. There can't be the resonance.
Kantian and utilitarian theories tend to isolate moral decisions in the present moment and to separate them from personal histories. Joel Kupperman calls this a snapshot view of ethical choice and emphasizes the long-term nature of some of our most basic ethical choices.
A lot of discipline, a lot of sustained effort that goes into success, and a lot of good character really involves the long haul, involves being willing to devote yourself to projects and stay with them for a considerable period of time. And a lot of morality involves the long haul also, being there for people who are relevant, who need you, not just today or tomorrow, but over a long period of time.
Each of us tends to see his or her life as a story. Virtue ethics recognizes this natural way of thinking in the importance it places on character and narrative.
A person's character, if somebody manages to have one, gives that person a sense of being a definite kind of person, being a real person, having a nature which is changeable and which is subject to circumstance, but still which involves some degree of continuity and reliability. And this sense of self both can play a part in moral choice, and also can play a part in somebody feeling that her or his life makes sense, and that there's a pattern to the life, a pattern provided by character, which gives a meaning to the life.
Narrative is the most powerful way of explaining to somebody what a virtue is. If you look at the narratives of some of the great mythical figures in the West, for example, Socrates, the life of Socrates, the way in which he stuck to his principles, even though it meant the loss of his life. The narrative of Jesus Christ, and the way that he remained true to his calling, even though it meant his life. If you look at these narratives. They explain, they communicate what the virtues are in a way that an abstraction can't.
Virtue ethics highlights a number of issues that utilitarian and Kantian theories seem to leave out. But does it run into the same problem? How adequate a basis for leading a moral life does virtue ethics provide? One criticism of virtue ethics is that in declining to provide clear rules for action, it fails to help people facing crises. For instance, does it give sufficient guidance to an unmarried woman deciding whether or not to have an abortion? Can it really help an employee struggling to deal with corrupt practices in his company?
It's not a theory about what people ought to do. It has some implications for our actions, but essentially, virtue theory is an inquiry into the kind of person we ought to be. But in ethics, the most pressing problems are problems about what we ought to do. What is it that I ought to do?
Another criticism of virtue ethics is that definitions of virtues vary from community to community. An order of monks or nuns might foster virtues such as modesty and celibacy. A police force, courage and honesty. A firm of lawyers, thoroughness and ingenuity. And a gang of criminals, ruthlessness and guile.
What this implies is that a virtue theory is radically relativistic. What is identified as a virtue in one community necessarily will be different from what a different community, another community, will identify as its virtues. And virtue theory by itself provides no adequate way of evaluating the claims made by those two different sets of virtues.
One very important thing that we should learn is that there is no incompatibility between virtue ethics and an emphasis on a universal account that also has a large room for principle.
But perhaps the most daunting challenge that can be posed to virtue ethics is to ask how many people actually do develop character that causes them to act morally.
Over the last 30 years, social psychology has been looking into this assumption of ordinary moral thinking, the assumption that that the explanation of why people act as they do is ever or sometimes due to character traits. And it's been very difficult to find any evidence that this is correct. So one thing social psychologists have discovered is the power of the situation to affect how people act.
One experiment to test the power of situations over moral character was devised by psychologist Stanley Milgram. The atrocities committed by ordinary citizens in Nazi Germany prompted Milgram to wonder how far people would go in hurting others when told to do so by someone in authority. Test subjects were led to believe they were taking part in a learning experiment.
There's a guy on the other side of a glass partition, and they're supposed to give him an electric shock every time he gives the wrong answer on a learning question. And really, of course, what's being tested is whether they will follow the orders of the man in the white coat standing next to them and give these electric shocks, which get more and more serious. And the guy on the other side of the glass partition, who's actually an actor, is pretending after a while to be writhing in agony and says he has a heart condition and wants to stop. And what was horrifying to Milgram, and he claimed it was a great surprise, was that more than well over 60% of the people he tested went on to the very end. which suggests that at least, if that's representative, that at least 60% of the population has very weak characters.
Virtue ethics points to wide gaps in other ethical theories, but seems to suffer from equally wide gaps of its own. Is there any way to approach ethics that can address all the important issues?
I think the way to approach moral philosophy, moral theory, is by taking each of the different moral theories as lenses on a moral situation, ways of looking at a moral situation. Each of the theories then forces us to ask questions about that moral situation that are not brought out by the other moral theories.
What lens does virtue ethics offer to help us look at particular situations and our lives as a whole?
There is a later writer who's much later than Aristotle, but who makes a very interesting metaphor for the good life. This is from Seneca, the Roman writer, who's a Stoic, who says that we think of our life in two ways. One is, as it were, linear. Each day goes on after the next day until you get to the end one. But he also thinks that at any moment of your life, you think of it as being within a set of concentric circles. The way you act today, the things you're doing today, have significance within a larger set of your concerns, and those concerns again within further sets of your concerns. And eventually, everything you're doing today reflects the values that you have in your life as a whole. So at any point, your life is proceeding onwards. But it also, from another point of view, reflects, even in miniature, even in one or two small things you do at any particular time, these reflect the values you have in your life as a whole.
The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online. Please order by program number.